Makes a huge difference if you'll do me a favor by subscribing and liking the podcast wherever you listen. It goes a long way. Thanks, and I hope you enjoy. In an ever more challenging world of work, as founder and CEO of Anthrome Insight, she is a practicing consultant and keynote speaker helping organizations with data-driven views and concrete actions to shape a productive future in chaotic times. She has held consulting leadership roles at Capgemini, Mercer, Korn Ferry, and Deloitte, and is the national best-selling author of Effective: How to Do Great Work in a Fast-Changing World and Work Here Now, Think Like a Human and Build a Powerhouse Workplace. All right, we are recording. Melissa, welcome to the Wisdom of Life.
It's great to be here.
Yeah. I want to start, offline we were talking about your excitement. I noticed in your bio, you said that you enjoy working on thorny problems. And my question is, how does working on thorny and difficult problems excite you?
I feel like I can be genuinely helpful. Because if you think about, why does any organization hire consultants, right? If the problem was straightforward or easy, that it's not like the companies that hire me have any shortage of brilliant folks internally, right? They have such smart people working for them already. But where I can actually do something above and beyond the folks that they already employ internally is when the problem is kind of so weird, so complex, so multifaceted. If you've heard the term wicked problem, right? Like poverty is a wicked problem.
Yes.
It's not like somebody's like, okay, this is easy. This is how you solve for poverty, right? It's just like it's this one weird trick, So in the one weird trick world, I really enjoy those problems that are like, like in the Odyssey when, Penelope, she's trying to unweave every night, right?
Yes.
It's unweaving these delicate, complicated tapestries. That's what really lights me up intellectually, because I think it lights me up emotionally too. I feel like I'm genuinely helping. It's not a performative exercise.
Yeah. Have you always been interested in wicky, thorny, difficult problems since you were a kid?
For sure. Absolutely. I mean, before, I did people consulting, I did sustainability consulting. So, try and square that circle of how do, organizations operate as good capitalist organizations, make money for shareholders, and also not damage the world around them. I mean, that's another thorny, wicked, complex problem. Those are the problems worth solving. Those are the really, really interesting ones where there's not an easy or an intuitive answer, where, you have to reconcile groups with really different views, and there's no one right way to do things. That's the fun stuff.
Yeah. What's fun about that for you?
Some of it is that our brains search for black and white answers, right? We want things to be, again, we want one weird trick.
Yeah.
We want to just kind of like pop the key in the door and turn the latch, and that's it. And actually solving these problems is more like if you've ever had to pick a lock, right? Where you're sitting there with two bobby pins and you're kind of jiggling different pieces. That's what solving these problems. It's more like that. And, putting a key in a lock is something anybody can do. Picking a lock requires some skill.
Yeah. And do you feel like work has gotten more complicated and there's more difficult problems today than there were decades ago?
So I think so. And I get beat up for this a lot. I've had people really yell at me about, no, Melissa, work has always been hard and people are just whiny and kids are just whiny these days. There's a lot of like really crummy rhetoric on the subject. And what I always say is it goes in cycles, and we're at a weird point in the cycle. So another comparable point would be the early industrial revolution.
Yeah.
Right? We built these great big amazing machines and we didn't quite know what to do with them, right? So human workers kept getting injured. You had like the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, you know what I mean? Like you had just terrible. I mean, that's why the HR function exists, because labor was literally in violent conflict with management. All this like wild stuff went on kind of as the Industrial Revolution sort of, came online through the years. And then things got better. We kind of, figured out what we needed in terms of everyday health and safety for workers. We figured out sensible ways where humans and machines could work together, sensible ways to run companies. And then we had this awesome productivity in kind of the middle of the 20th century. right? It
Yeah.
it was good for people and it made more money. And I think, these are the cycles. If you look at, there's some great data from MIT about working hours, that there have been points in history when people really didn't work a lot of hours. And they're not the points you'd think. It was like the height of the agrarian economy. Yeah, it was hard work, but people also had a lot of time not working. Whereas, again, beginning of the Industrial Revolution, they worked more hours than most of us do, today. And it cycles in and out. So I say, I think with all of the technology we've added, all the complexity, the globalization, like all positive things have led us to a point where work is just this beast right
Yeah.
now, but cycles. We're just at a weird point in a cycle.
Uh-huh. And how do we navigate that weird point in the cycle if, like you're saying, it's been around, it's happened before?
Number one, there's just a really basic question of humans working alongside machines. And so that's why I use the early industrial revolution example, because it's sort of a brute force example. Everyone can understand that a factory machine should not cut your arm off, right? That's clear. That's clear. We all get it. Translate that through to, right? That's just it. Okay, certain things shouldn't be happening at work. We got it. We got it. But translate that through to, okay, well, maybe, human beings shouldn't be on 18 30-minute Zoom calls in a row in one day. And people are like, oh, you're being a wimp. And no, it's the same thing. It's whether you're causing kind of a neurological injury or a physical injury.
Yeah.
You have humans working with machines in a way that injures them. And the machines are just neutral. The technology is just neutral. It's not good or bad. I mean, we can argue about aspects of it. Like, it really creeps me out that AI, which, by the way, I use daily, has been sort of programmed to lie to people. That's weird, and we should talk about that. But in general, technology is neutral, and we just have to figure out how the two things work together. And I think a lot of the core of modern work is just that we currently have more technology deployed than we really know how to work alongside.
Yeah. And right now, I think, at least in the US, I don't know, internationally, I feel like there's this sense of fear and dread that the technology is going to replace us at middle and lower levels. How do you think about that, or how do you speak to that?
There's always, again, been an element of that if you look at what happened when electricity was invented, right? There was tons of that rhetoric, or the internal combustion engines. And the reality is some jobs did go away, but a whole bunch more jobs were created. Technology is sort of inevitably job creating. And I don't quite understand why AI vendors sort of went out with this rhetoric of, unlike every other technology in the history of humanity, it's wildly job destroying. I think it was just like the world's biggest change management mistake. And to your point about sort of geographical differences, I do think some of this rhetoric is very US specific. I had the privilege last week to spend some time teaching a bunch of EMBA students from Italy. And interestingly, because the European Union has really sort of led with, let's get our arms around this technology, let's regulate, they cited some downsides. We feel like we might be behind, we have concerns about kind of our pace, but they also cited some upsides, that their workplaces don't have the same sort of fear and dread dynamics going on that many American workplaces do. So, as in so many things, the right answer is probably somewhere in the middle, right? It's not the full American go, 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 and it's not the full European, let's study the problem for 10 years before we start to think about solving it. It's probably somewhere in the middle.
Where do you think that happy middle lies?
The guidance that I give, in programs like this and to organizations, is that the conversation should really just be around augmentation. And again, how are humans and technology working together? How are technologies like AI assisting people? The automation conversation, just because a task can be automated doesn't mean, and it's part of your job, doesn't mean your job can be automated. Just because multiple tasks within your job can be automated doesn't mean your job, full automation takes a lot more than people think it does, right? Where you would truly not have humans reviewing the output, reviewing the input, checking the process. I share with audiences, there's a great list of, I think it's either 15 or 16 reasons that a certain kind of, any kind of work would be hard for AI to do. And it's hilarious because it just reads like a set of things that describe every workplace ever. So it'll be things like different leaders have different views of the task. Well, If you've ever worked in a company of any kind, right? Of course, different leaders have different views of the task. So,
Yeah.
you put some of that kind of common sense back in and you say it's going to be about augmentation. It's going to be about how it augments human capabilities. And it's a much easier, more fun conversation that doesn't freak everybody out. It also puts people on the right track in terms of, oh, okay, well, if that's the challenge, I might have an idea for how that could happen. And it doesn't shut down the creativity. And actually, it's like a slow down to speed up thing. You can move faster if that's the conversation.
It, how can you move faster if that's a conversation effectively?
Say part of the gap often is, and I talk about this in chapter 1 of the book, you have to actually look the work in the eye. And this is something that we are weirdly unwilling to do. And this is one of the major gaps in why work doesn't get better, why work remains like weird and thorny and difficult to deal with, is you have to be willing to sit down and say, okay, if I'm a leader, what do the people on my team actually do all day? So many leaders, if you ask them that question, would go, I'm not quite sure. I believe that each one of us should, and I actually have a methodology in the book for doing this, sit there and say, okay, what is my job? What do I do? Okay, what does my boss think my job is? What does my end customer think my job is? What does my boss's boss think my job is? And actually looking at your work through those multiple prisms, you get a capture on what the work actually is. So once you know what the work actually is, it's a lot easier to talk about, well, how might, technology help or questions like that. But if you don't know what the work actually is, then it's really hard to strategize around it. And that's why you get these, things like, 95% of AI pilots fail. Well, not necessarily because of the AI, probably because of false underlying assumptions about the work. So I really think effectiveness is grounded in just being incredibly honest and clear about what your work actually is. And by the way, any conflicts or contradictions that might be part of that.
What do you think are the primary reasons or causes why we're afraid to look at exactly what the work is and talk about it?
Some of it is that sadly it's your brain shortcutting. So it's easier day to day to just fall into a routine of kind of doing things that seem okay, right? And they might seem okay for totally the wrong reasons, but it's sort of path of least resistance activities. And it's much easier for leaders not to confront the reality of what their people do all day, because then there might be things that they need to change, they need to fix, they need to, communicate about differently. It's great to kind of sit up on the mountain and, just spout a bunch of platitudes about, well, we're going to really tighten this team up. It's much harder to say, okay, here are my specific suggestions for how we're going to redesign the work of this team. Right. The first, example anyone can do. The second example, you actually have to be a good manager, and that requires more of people.
And when we require more of people and they feel they're already stretched thin, how do you approach that?
I think, again, this is the slow down to speed up maneuver. That part of why they're so stretched is that things are sort of organized chaotically, that they're not acknowledging the work that people do, that probably people on their team are both doing redundant work, doing pieces of each other's jobs, and there are pieces that should be in someone's job that no one is doing. And so that feels like a bucking bronco, right? And you're just constantly meeting to meeting, just patching things up. Whereas if you took a moment and said, okay, what's the work of this team? Is it divided up properly? Is it assigned properly when tasks come in? And, you hear all this, and you're like, God, that's so boring and mechanical. But the reality is doing that sort of cleanup once, doing that deep structural cleanup, it's not like you then have to do it again every 5 minutes. It's more of, okay, is the underlying structure of how work flows through this team, is that functioning or not? Do that once, and on a go forward basis, suddenly everything feels a lot smoother. And as a manager, you feel less besieged. You're not mediating battles between, people who are both on the same piece of turf. You're not correcting for things that got missed. You're not parsing 20 mixed signals about something. There's a basic shared sense of what everyone's supposed to be doing.
Yeah, to me, what you're describing is number one, people's energy is pointed towards the actual mission. Second, they are like sled dogs working together towards the destination.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that piece about energy all getting pointed in the right direction. I always think about the sort of the light bulb versus the laser, right? That a lot of times what we do with people, it's kind of like it's a light bulb model. Okay, it's sort of I can see through most of this room. They're doing tasks over here and it's here and it's here and the light's going this way and that way. The way a laser works, right? All to your point, it's all pointed in the same direction, and the laser can like cut through steel.
Yes.
And that's truly, what we need. But the thing about a laser versus a light bulb is a light bulb is like warm and comforting, All we're doing so many different things. It feels nice. It's like an emotional placebo. Whereas like a laser is scary, sharks with freaking lasers on their heads, right? There's something slightly terrifying about that. But we have to I think we have to kind of embrace that, because the reality is that it's also uncomfortable on a long range basis to not achieve the things you want to achieve. And I think a lot of particularly knowledge work organizations really grapple with that these days. So if you're, professional services, financial services, tech, right? There's this sense of like, why are we not getting more done? And that's why we're being diffuse with our energy instead of really focused.
And to me, that's inefficient and ineffective. And it's like, and then the answer a lot of times it feels like is, well, we just need to do more. We need to work harder and we need to work longer.
Which is exhausting. By the way, there's really good research that shows, there's some great research out of Stanford a few years ago that said basically after about 55 hours a week, productivity goes off a cliff. And after 70 hours a week, you're basically not productive at all. So at that point, it is literally just empty activity.
Yeah.
That work harder, do more, which to your point is that is the mantra in so many organizations. But, if you said, well, okay, I want you to work 15 more hours and 10 of those hours were going to be completely wasted, why are we doing this to ourselves? And it's interesting. I was just reviewing and, I don't actually have a dog in the fight about what is the right length of, the work day, the work week, whatever. But there's good data that if you can bring that brute force number of hours down, then people sleep more. And employees who have slept are just like they're both happier people and better employees.
Yes.
That, there's data that shows that coming to work on too little sleep is quite similar actually to coming to work drunk, which most companies would discourage.
Right. Most companies. Maybe not Coors or something, but
I will allow for exceptions,
yeah,
but you don't want employees that are that cognitively compromised, right? You don't want people that literally can't think because they haven't slept. And anything you can do to reduce the number of hours people work increases sleep, and it's linear. You would, if you said there's a pill you can give your employees and it'll make them smarter. Okay, oh my gosh, everybody would give their employees that pill.
Yes.
Well, pill is bringing the number of working hours down, and that's where we get weird about it.
Yeah. Do you think this is where we get weird about it globally, or it's more certain countries? Because what I notice, even when people are doing a really good job in any field, there is a tendency in the United States to say, well, let's double click on that. Let's do more of that. And versus like, hey, awesome. And forgetting about the rest period, the recharge period.
Yeah, no, fully. And, again, there are places where it's worse and tougher. If you look at some of the working norms in China, for instance, you see really tough, all this discussion of what is it, 996, 966, something like that, right? Where you're supposed to be working most days out of the week. You're supposed to be working very long working days, et cetera, et cetera. And then you go over to Europe, right? And again, you may even have structural protections around hours worked. And you have interesting interim points. I mean, I worked in the UK for a few years, and, we would always talk about in the UK, it's an interesting middle point between a continental European sort of vision of what good working hours look like and an American version of what good working hours look like. And so it's sort of the average of the two. You get, within Asia Pacific, you have massive variations as to what's encouraged, what's acceptable. It's interesting. There's a lot of nuance, but I do think there is something in American working culture at the moment where, to your point, that this need to stamp out every piece of blank space and every piece of sort of rest and recovery is a toxic tendency.
Do you think it stems from, or maybe I'll ask, where do you think that stems from?
It is that, we're, what do we call ourselves? A pioneer culture, that certainly a lot of folks, kind of came to this country to build something different. And that's kind of the good side of the spirit, right? Of, I want to take advantage of every opportunity that this amazing country can give to me, right? And that's like the positive side, like the really good entrepreneurial business energy, right? That's the awesome stuff. Nation built by immigrants, right? Like we love that stuff. Where I think it gets a bit darker is that we've had over the last, call it 5 or 6 decades, both an increase in company size and complexity, and also executive compensation has taken off in an exponential way, completely sort of divorced from average worker compensation. And so what that's done is it puts a monkey on executives' backs. It creates a huge amount of anxiety for, well, if I'm going to be paid this outrageous amount of money, right, what can I actually do to, and it seems like the obvious answer is just more, 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 right? Nobody rest, nobody relax, do more. But I do think it's tied to some of these kind of the actual compensation trends. And that's a little bit of what's pushed it, coupled with the scale and complexity, meaning that, if you're one person supervising, maybe a couple of junior lawyers and an assistant in a small law office, then, you kind of understand what's going on. If you're a, gigantic law firm with hundreds of lawyers and et cetera, you're getting more distant from the work. And again, you're going to look at more brute force tactics because you're not in the day-to-day specifics.
You've lost your understanding of what is really going on.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Coupled with you're under much greater pressure because again, we're paying you all this money.
Curious on that because it seems like people, let's say the leadership management that is paid more money, maybe let's say double, triple, or exponentially, but they have not developed the skills to handle the pressure that they are dealing with. So it's that, everything's a nail because I got a hammer approach.
And they don't have, they're getting 10x the compensation they would have in, 1972 or whatever. They don't have 10x the leadership skills.
Yes.
And that's tricky. And I think people, I'm not unsympathetic to that challenge for executives that at a certain point, I've been there as a leader myself where, I've been in situations where I've had such a high number of people on my team in crisis, for instance.
Yes.
That one human being couldn't really fix the problem in the way that a leader with high standards, would want the problem to be fixed. And that's a bit of it too, is there's a retreat from unfixable problems because it's great all the way up to, like we talked about earlier, it's great all the way up to the problem being high complexity. When the problem seems actually unsolvable, humans have a really different emotional reaction. And that's some of what you see is you retreat and you bluster. And these are all kind of understandable human reactions. And some of it is we've played with org structure so much in last couple decades that, all right, we're going to take out middle managers. Well, what happens when you take out middle managers is the managers that are left have much greater spans of control. They've got more and more people to manage. And then you're like, well, why is everybody so terrible at being a leader? Well, if you're managing 20 people as opposed to 5 people, yeah, at a certain point, there's degradation in what you can do for each person. So, I think sometimes these structural changes have really unintended consequences on kind of quality of leadership, and leaders have an understandable reaction to, okay, I don't know that I can overcome this degree of structural, problems.
And when faced with that, what you're saying is they retreat and go to almost like, I'm going to erase that idea of that problem from my mind. It doesn't exist.
It doesn't exist. People are whining, right? You hear that a lot from leaders. Oh, people are just whining. And then what's darkly entertaining is sometimes you get these great corporate crises or great corporate meltdowns. And inevitably, somebody, or usually a collection of somebody's, tried to tell leadership there was a problem. And leadership kind of went, oh, they're whining. And they ignored good data, good management information that if they treated it in an emotionally neutral, emotionally uninflected way, they would have been able to act on it and you wouldn't have had these kind of epic meltdowns.
So I'm friends with some military vets, and this makes me think of the after action review or debriefing process in the military. And I was at a conference once, a leadership conference. I sat down for breakfast with a gentleman, didn't know who he was, introduced himself and myself. And turns out he was a retired Navy SEAL. And I said, we love the glorifying the Navy SEALs in the United States. I said, what do you think the difference between the Navy SEALs and some of the other military branches, special forces are? He didn't even hesitate. He said, it's our daily commitment to debriefing. He said, so we sat there for like 45 minutes talking about this. It was fascinating. I was in New York City, I remember. And he said, we do a really good job in the training of our debriefing process. We've taken the emotion out of as much as we can as humans, but we've left the future impact.
I love that. I love that. And there's something, and there's a whole chapter on this in my book on the kind of the lessons of high stakes jobs, that jobs like, being a Navy SEAL, where you cannot screw up, really have something to teach the rest of us. And that's a fantastic example. But this idea of, it's interesting because I heard something similar when I interviewed a New York City firefighter, this guy, Ro Rodriguez, who had just amazing insights on like what the day-to-day of being a firefighter is like. And he talked about that. He said, when we're not working, we like sit around all the time and talk about how we can do stuff better.
Yes.
And that's that discipline. That's exactly what you're alluding to. And what you have to do that is you need a culture that's kind of low ego. Because when you talk about things that went wrong, okay, people did those things, right? So if I'm so high ego and I'm so fragile that I can't say, well, you know what, I really screwed the pooch on that part. And I think that's something that we cannot do that way again. You have to be able to admit accountability. And that's the interesting thing, right? When you meet a firefighter or a Navy SEAL, half the time you'll be like, gee, that's like the most humble person I've ever met in my life.
Yes.
But I don't think it's an accident, right? That's what makes it possible for them to do these jobs really well, is not having the ego, being able to go back and reflect, and being able to really, really learn, which again, your average corporate executive could take a lot of lessons from.
Yeah, I believe so, because there's a difference between having an experience and repeating that experience for life or your career and thinking, well, yeah, I've got 30, 40 years of experience. But without the reflection and the willingness to change and improve, what do you have? You've gone in the merry-go-round of experience.
Yeah, you might as well be a first-year analyst if you're not iteratively getting better from the mistakes that you made. That's what you have to learn from. And granted, you can learn from other people's mistakes too. But if you can't trace that mental pathway back and say, okay, I need to do this differently the next time, then yeah, you're stuck in professional childhood forever. And you do meet some very senior people who behave like children, and who cannot admit that anything they ever did might have been slightly amiss.
Because their ego's at stake, do you think?
Yeah, it's a fragility thing, right? It's I can't stand to think that I'm anything less than perfect, so I have to sort of like puff myself up to Macy's Thanksgiving Day parade balloon size. How can you think I'm less when I'm like the size of this giant turkey or whatever?
Yeah.
It's a self-protection strategy. And I think how we operate in workplaces is around self-protection. It's around managing our own anxiety. It's around managing the anxiety of others. So anything we can do to get to those more emotionally neutral exchanges of facts, that's the right place to be.
How do you go about that? If you've gone into organizations as a consultant and you notice that right away, how do you attack that or navigate that?
You can't suppress the emotion. I always give the analogy of if you hold the lid on a boiling pot, right? Eventually it's going to either one of two things is going to happen. Either it's going to shoot off, or you get like a pressure cooker type phenomenon where you've completely deformed all the vegetables inside. Like that doesn't look like a turnip anymore. It gets weird. So you can't suppress the emotion. You need to acknowledge it. You need to acknowledge where it came from. For the book, I interviewed Jim Dietert, who's a wonderful professor at UVA who studies some of this stuff. And I think he's like an absolute guru. And one of
Mm.
the things he talked about was by the time somebody is angry at work, it's probably because somebody didn't listen to them multiple times. They probably had a point that they expressed in a calm, neutral way, and somebody didn't listen. And then they expressed it maybe slightly more emotionally, but still pretty calm, again, and somebody didn't listen. And then by the time they're angry and they're yelling, it's like their sixth or seventh time trying to say the same thing, which they believe to be an important thing to be said, which a lot of the time is an important thing to be said. But then you get this weird dynamic of, well, I can't listen to you if you're going to be so emotional. And you're pressing the lid back on the pot.
Right.
Don't do that. So Dietrich's excellent advice is, acknowledge, okay, I want to hear what you have to say. I want to hear what you have to say. I believe what you have to say might be important. Let me hear what you have to say, and just create that vector for listening. Because if you suppress the emotion's not going to go away. If
Yeah.
you, take the lid off the pot, say, okay, things calm down. When people feel they can be heard, a lot of the emotion goes out of the room. And I think it's a powerful technique, and it's something any one of us can do, but we have to suppress this instinctive thing of like, oh God, emotions at work, shut it down, shut it down. We got to stop doing that.
Do you think we have to suppress it or we have to understand it better?
Where it's coming from.
Yeah.
That, okay, if for many years, I had the sort of the neurosis that if I allowed people to be emotional in meetings with me, people would be like, oh, well, women leaders, of course, everyone was like crying and holding hands in that meeting. Like, that's how girls lead. I truly believed that. I truly, truly believe that. And, I've come to consciousness about that. And I've said, no, actually managing emotion appropriately, giving voice to people is one of my superpowers. And I'm going to embrace that. And I'm going to lean into that. And anyone that has frankly, sexist thoughts on the subject can feel free to articulate those thoughts and we'll have a conversation.
Yeah. Well, you did your undergrad at Harvard, right?
Yes.
I believe the psychology building is in William James's name.
Yes.
And he said that every human being, no matter the culture, the age, gender, doesn't matter their background, everyone wants to feel valued, heard, appreciated. Doesn't matter. And I really believe that he just realized that, but that's always been the case and always will be the case.
I completely agree. I completely agree. And I think what's important today is what's stopping us from doing that, right? What gets in the way of, hearing people, treating them like they're valued, treating them like they matter? How many books about mattering have come out in the last,
Yeah.
few years,
Yeah.
right? We know this stuff. Okay, so what's stopping us? That's the question that I'm very interested in. And I think some of it is, again, it's just a sheer numbers game. Too many meetings, too many direct reports, right? It's harder to listen to individuals and treat them like they matter. Again, if you have 20 direct reports as opposed to 10, just
Yes.
harder. There's just numbers game stuff going on. So then the question becomes, okay, well, I'm not in charge of the org design for my organization. I'm going to have 20 direct reports. Okay, how do I schedule my week so I can hear from them? What's the right strategy? Is it I do, less frequent, longer one-on-ones? Do I do shorter, more frequent one-on-ones? Do I do a combination of one-on-ones and small group? I've seen executives do a lot of really interesting optimization for this, and there's no one exactly right answer. Is
Yeah.
it I meet with my peers fewer times so I can meet with my direct reports more, or actually right now I really need to meet with my peers, so I'm going to communicate with my direct reports more on kind of real-time little pings and stuff. Again, no right answer, but I think just kind of consciously thinking about that numbers game and the clutter game that's getting in the way of treating people in a way that acknowledges their humanity and gets the best from them, that's what you got to strategize around.
Yeah, exactly. Because why are we doing what we're doing? If we go to the origin of like, okay, we as an organization, we want to achieve a goal. Let's say for a lot of them, it's making as much money as possible, driving as much revenue as possible. And then we need people to do that. So we need those people to be productive and effective. So how do you go about one? You talk about, right, about how we recognize our sources of power and shut down the forces sapping them. How do you attack that, approach
When
that?
I was writing this book, I got interested in this, again, like sort of almost annoyingly basic question of what makes you good at your job?
Mm.
I noticed that in a lot of the work that I've done with workforce transformation, right? It'll be like, we have a 60,000 skills in our ontology. We have 30,000 skills in our taxonomy. We have just these elaborate lists and lists and lists of skills. And they get goofy when you start to add them up. I'll never forget looking at the skills in one system for being a pilot. And one of the skills was air traffic control, and one of the skills was leadership. Now, you get the old, Sesame Street. These things are not like each other, right? These are not the same category of thing,
Yes.
So I'm going, in amidst all this confusion, what do you actually have to be good at? So I looked at a lot of these systems and I said, okay, well, what's the underlying superstructure of all of these little discrete skills? How are people, where do they come from? And so it's really four things. Number one, and you may be good at all four, you may be good at one of the four, two of the four, et cetera, but most of us have kind of one point of strength within these, one real source of power. So number one, knowledge. There's stuff you just have to know to do your job. So, for me, for being an organizational consultant, it's fundamentals of organizational behavior and organizational design, psychology, right? There's all these different fields, but there's basically knowledge, right? I'm a knowledge person. I'm a geek.
Yeah.
And you can tell if you're a knowledge person because people will come to you for knowledge. You're like, if you hit the point of you're like, can you just ask Claude that? I'm so sorry. Right? You're a knowledge person. Second category, methods. This is the one I'm worst at. This is the piece about how do you operationalize? How do you put it all together? Some of my best working relationships have been where I found another person who was really, really good at methods and we teamed up. Right. And it was such a great combination. And and so if you're good at methods, you might find that the organization bounces you around, right? That you don't stay necessarily in one division or one geography. It's like, well, Kevin's good at solving problems. Let's ask Kevin to solve this problem. Let's ask Kevin to solve this problem, So, methods people are like great operators. That's another sort of category. And then the other two categories are just how well you use certain kind of deploy certain kinds of resources. So some people are really good with people.
Yeah.
If you're the person where people are always crying in your office, okay, that's great. You've created an environment where people come to you. You are good with people. And then you might be good with technology. A funny repeated experience that I capture in the book, and then people have played this back to me about, oh my God, when I read that in the book, that really resonated, is you end up getting treated like IT support, even though that's not your job at all.
Yeah.
Right? And it's funny, you don't have to be like a super techie person, but there's a certain kind of brain where you've just gotten really good at figuring out how to use the technology you use at work. And, people will come to you for that. Tech is your superpower.
Do you think the operator and the tech person are pretty similar, or there can be a crossover between those two? Do you notice a pattern there?
They're very aligned in kind of the current scenario. So, if you think about people's attitudes toward AI, knowledge people like me, we'll use it, but we side-eye it. Every time it gets something wrong, we get really annoyed, right? Because it's like our precious knowledge. Woo! You messed up my precious knowledge.
Exactly.
Similarly, people will side-eye it too. Like, okay, it's great if it helps me write a better email to this person, but also as a people person, I'm very sensitive to how people communicate with me. And I know that person used AI to write that email and I feel weird and da-da-da. Whereas people who are good at tech and people who are good at methods are just very super aligned around the fact, well, if AI can help me just get more things done, I'm here for it. And they don't have those other concerns. And it's just differences in wiring, just fundamental mental wiring. And you need all four groups to properly staff an organization. You probably need all four groups within most teams. And it's interesting, even when you go to a function that should be sort of unidimensional. So like IT organizations, I'm always struck when I, do work with IT organizations that they really have all four groups in spade. It's not all tech people, right? You've got project managers who are really good at methods. You've got people who have better technological knowledge than they have tech ability. And you need both, right? You need the knowledge people and the tech people. And then you have people sprinkled throughout who are the people who are making the whole kind of human scheme of the IT organization work. So I think it's a great example of how your job doesn't necessarily predict for your sort of source of power.
And how do you eliminate or shut down forces that are sapping your effectiveness, productivity, power? How do you approach that?
Well, I think know what's going on. So, For example, the forces that I look at in the book, there's work intensification. So that might be too many tasks in too little time. That might be work that's too interdependent. You have to basically talk to too many other people to get any given task done. Within large organizations, this drives people nuts.
Yep.
It might be work that's emotionally intensified, which there's a separate chapter on in the book because I think emotional intensification is such a big deal. Things might be chaotic in a way that's not work intensified, just all over the map, or you might need dealing with the impacts of something I call hypertransparency, which is this really interesting phenomenon where if you think about it, an old-fashioned, like a 1955, like Mad Men era CEO, how they led was through information advantage. They knew so much more than the average worker.
Yeah.
Today, between data-driven organizations, social media, pay transparency, that information advantage has really collapsed. And there are moments when people down the org chart have better and more information than people up the org chart. And that is really doing leaders' heads in. And I think it's something we need to pay more attention to. That it's just, again, that one is not a good or a bad thing. The other three are kind of like straightforwardly bad things. Hypertransparency it has good and bad aspects, but we have to manage it better.
What are the good and the bad aspects of hypertransparency?
In general, I really do believe the old adage about sunlight is the best disinfectant. I think when there is more transparency on what companies are doing, what leaders' behaviors are like, in general, they behave better. If you're polluting in secret or you're bullying your team in secret, and no one ever finds out, you're probably just going to keep doing it. Whereas if there's proper transparency, that corrects things back to people put pressure on you and you do the right thing ultimately. So in general, that's good and that's helpful. Pay transparency legislation was introduced in part to correct for continuing inequities in pay. That if a role is, this is the money for the job, then you can't get away with paying one group more and another group less. That is really good stuff. And the world has become more transparent. This is an interesting kind of source of intergenerational conflict sometimes in the workplace, is that, leaders will say, well, these junior folks, they expect to know everything and they can't know everything. And you're right? There are all these topics like, stuff that's legally protected for your coworkers, M&A. There are many things that you can't know, but there might be more things that they should know, right? And this is all good transparency. I think the dark side comes when there's a lot of information floating around and not all of it's right. A lot of the leaders that I interviewed for the book actually talked about spending time debunking myths and correcting incorrect information. And the problem with this hyper-transparent, everybody's chatting on the group chat and talking about the company on social media, texting each other. And there's just a lot of stuff swirling around and you get stuff that's not true. And having to spend time kind of stamping out things that are not true, again, really, really exhausts leaders. And I think that's an interesting, but the fundamental advice I give is have your house in order. Tausif Rahman, who I interviewed for the book, was talking about how if somebody said, well, can I come over? Oh yeah, sure, come over. Okay, great. I'm right outside your door. You'd be frantically cleaning things up, right? Like, oh my God. So don't be in a position where you have to frantically clean things up. Like act, consistently, ethically, empathically, even when nobody's looking. And then when somebody's looking, things will go better.
I love that. It's going back to the foundation, going back to the basics, the fundamentals.
Absolutely. And at root, this book is a book about fundamentals because I'm very back to the future on some of this stuff. I think in some ways we've overcomplicated the discourse, and fundamentals like good plain spoken communication, behaving responsibly and ethically, using technology in a way that does not harm yourself or others. These are just basic things. Like let's re-embrace all that.
Yeah, exactly. And then it eliminates a lot of the junk from, it makes me think of Dan Heath's book, Upstream.
Oh, I don't know that one.
I think you love it. I'm a big fan of his work. And he's at Duke Business School, and he tells the famous story of people are falling in the river and other people, and they don't know how to swim. And this is how the book starts. And other people are jumping in to rescue them. And there's all this energy going in that direction downstream. And he says, but no one's ever going upstream and asking, like, why are people standing on the river's edge and falling in to begin with? And then they can't swim.
Right.
And then, and he goes, we do this over and over and over again, where we're expending so much energy and we're not accomplishing a lot. And
Absolutely.
it's amazing.
Absolutely. Yeah. Come back and ask the simple questions and don't be afraid
Yes.
of looking stupid, asking the dumb questions. I have, in my life, in meetings where I've said, I have a dumb question, 99% of the time, it was the thing that needed to be asked.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So we're coming up on time. We're going to land this plane. So, Melissa, where can people find your book, Effective: How to Do Great Work in a Fast Changing World? Where can they find out more about you if they want to and reach out to you and consult with you and work with you? And then finally, third part of the question is any closing thoughts that you'd like to share with my audience?
So the book is available wherever books are sold. So if they're selling books, Effective is there. You can find me on LinkedIn, Melissa Swift. Also, my website, anthrominsight.com. That's ANTHROMEINSIGHT.com. I also have a moderate presence on Instagram and TikTok, trying to, again, keep up with the younger generations. So, I would say a lot of this stuff is kind of simple but not easy. So when I
Mhm.
say some of these things are pretty simple or they're coming back to basics, it doesn't mean, oh, well, you should have had it done yesterday. I say that with a lot of appreciation for the difficulty of implementing simple strategies in complex environments. So I always want to kind of provide that caveat.
Yeah, I appreciate that because I say this a lot of times to different people over the years that simple does not mean easy.
Right.
We cloud those two, we confuse
Hmm.
those two, we just merge 'em, and they're completely different meanings and directions and destinations.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. This has been a real pleasure to learn from you and talk with you.
Been a great conversation. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Thank you for listening to this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and if you liked it, please share with a friend on social media. That goes a long way to promoting this podcast so I can continue to interview and share these conversations with fascinating people. You can follow me on social media, Chad Stoloff, and visit my website, chadstoloff.wordpress.com, for more information. I'd love it if you would leave a review to support the podcast. Thanks so much. Until next time.